Hello, I am David Colgan, and tonight I would like to talk to you about why Django is still a good choice for building your SaaS startup. So a little bit about me. I am a freelance web developer. I've been doing this for about 6 years now, and I build custom SaaS apps. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it stands for Software as a Service. Many of the websites that you use online could be categorized as a SaaS. Anything that is a pure software product, so anything that, these kind of things often have like a monthly recurring subscription, so things like Salesforce, Basecamp, Gmail could be considered a SaaS product. And so I work with a lot of companies that either have a young SaaS app or are wanting to build one from scratch, and so I help people build them. And so tonight I want to talk about how to choose the technology to build your SaaS, why I think Django is a great choice. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about a little bit about why do businesses hire developers, because this will give kind of a background into the choice of technology. And so I'd like to start with a story. About a year or two after I graduated from college, I was contacted by my university, and they said to me, David, we have a student who needs a practicum. Would you like to hire him as an intern? And I was like, oh, an intern. I could, get some management experience, maybe have somebody I can delegate to, get a whole bunch done, have a personal minion/slave or something like that. I don't think that turned out to be a good mindset, because it did turn out relatively poorly. I now have a lot more respect for the managers in the room. It is harder to manage than just telling people what to do. I didn't do a very good job of providing structure, and I also micromanaged, so I kind of blame myself for most of the problems that happened. But I'll never forget a conversation that I had with my intern towards the end of our time together. We were kind of debriefing, and he was frustrated, and I was frustrated, and I said to him, why do you think I hired you in the first place? And his answer I have never forgotten. He says, because you're nice? Not exactly. I recently learned that there is such a thing as Indiana nice. I didn't know about this until like 2 years ago. Apparently people from Indiana are nicer than people who are not from Indiana. And I consider myself to be a nice person, but there's actually no nice in business. If you look on the irs.gov website, it says that a business expense must pass the necessary expense test, and that means that the expense has to provide for the production of income. So it is actually, the IRS will bust your chops if you try to be nice in your hiring. The correct answer to the question of why do you think I hired you is to get a return on the investment of money that you put into the employee. So businesses hire developers to get a return on investment. And in companies, you're paid, this usually translates into increased revenue or lower costs. That is why companies exist, and ideally you will contribute to that. And so you can level up yourself as a freelancer, employee, whatever you do, if you think in terms of the business value that your code, whatever it is that you do, brings to the business. I've heard it said that the difference between a freelancer and a consultant is that a freelancer is someone who just does what they're told, and a consultant is someone who helps determine what to do, and then may actually do the thing, but they may also delegate that to somebody else. And consultants make more than freelancers usually. So thinking about the business value makes you stupidly valuable to whoever you're working with, because you'll make decisions that will have in mind increasing profits or reducing costs, things like that. And you may be thinking, well, I'm a programmer, I don't do business. But the good news is, though it is hard to be the very best, like no one ever was, Pokemon TM, at code, and though it is very hard to be the very best, like no one ever was, at business, being really good at both code and business at the same time is not nearly as hard. You can be sufficiently competent at both. That gives you superpowers as a developer. And the reason for that is that technology is black magic to the non-technical business owner. This is one of my favorite email exchanges that I've ever had. I have a client, I do the management of his SaaS app. He is very non-technical. And another guy does the hosting of the marketing site. And so he was going to switch the server to something else, and then he gave the status update. I went ahead and moved the DNS to Cloudflare instead of AWS Route 53. I recently learned that Cloudflare is 5 times as fast as Route 53, so that's a no-brainer to me. In fact, AWS's DNS service is surprisingly one of the slowest on the market. The stakeholder replied, I don't understand a word of what you said except that you moved the server. Thanks. So, Cloudflare? Are we in Middle Earth? Are you doing magic to my server? What is a Cloudflare? This is, So, in light of that, how do we choose a technology? Because if the choice of technology is completely opaque to the person who is the stakeholder, if you have a non-technical person in charge of the company, this is a place where you can really leverage your technical understanding to directly affect the bottom line. So how do you choose a technology? If you're doing a side project, you might choose a technology because you want to learn something new, which is a great reason for doing a side project. If you want to use cool technologies, there are a lot of really fancy web frameworks out these days that are pretty nifty. If you want to advance the state of the art, if you're doing open source, that's lovely and excellent. But none of these are really good reasons for choosing a technology in a business context. For my startup, especially an early one, the number one thing that I want to take into account when choosing something is reducing risk. This is a guy who I am a disciple of, so to speak, Patrick McKenzie. He has made several SaaS apps of increasing complexity. His advice is, don't make the technology the risky bet of the startup. There are already enough risky bets because you're starting a new company. You don't know if people want the thing you're building. And so if you are using an unproven technology that ends up causing you problems, that doesn't add anything to the business value. It becomes a liability. And you could even say that all code is liability because we have to maintain it. If we could just buy the software off the shelf, that would be the right choice. It's always cheaper to buy software than it is to build it yourself. There's a guy, Jack Diederich. He's presented at a couple of conferences. All of his talks are about how he hates code, and he started each of them with this line, I hate code and I want as little of it as possible in our product. I love this line because the more code you have, I think it's been said that every 1,000 lines of code has around 15 bugs, regardless of what that code does. So it would behoove you to have as little code as possible. Okay, so now that we've gotten into this introduction, now we can get to the reason we're here. Why does Django reduce business risk? Why is it a good choice? The first thing that I want to talk about is that Django is a mature technology. As we mentioned, don't make technology the risky bet of your software startup. There's a curious phenomenon that has been observed in a number of different instances called the Lindy effect, which says, on average, the life expectancy of a technology is equivalent to its age. So cars have been around since for 100 years. There will probably be cars in 100 years, on average. It's not saying there will definitely be cars in 100 years, but there probably will be, because it's been around so long. Books, depending on what you measure, what you count as a book, have been around for hundreds or thousands of years. Books are probably not going away anytime soon, regardless of what Amazon wants to do with them. If we look at this table of framework ages, Django is 12 years old, which is like ancient in dog years, because the web ages really fast like dogs do. Django and Rails are about 12 years old, so we could probably say that on average Django will probably be around for at least 12 more years, meaning that you have at least 12 years before you have to worry about replacing your entire app or something like this. Whereas some of these newer technologies have interesting attributes, but they're also younger and less mature, they may not be as likely to survive as long for a number of reasons. And this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it is a heuristic, as we talked about in the last talk. And one reason for that. Question, what do all slick new frameworks have in common? That's right, churn. What is churn? Churn is the best practices haven't been established yet, and so we keep changing our mind on what those are. If I'm going to pick on React tonight because that is the technology that I have observed the longest since its infancy. I quite like React, but it does illustrate a number of things. One of which was in JavaScript land, you have to have a build tool because the browser doesn't fully know how to run all of your code because we're being really fancy. So you had to compile your JavaScript into a different kind of JavaScript that would run in the browser. And there were all of these different ways of doing that. Webpack seems to have won. But 2 years ago, there were about 10 choices. All of these except for 2 were technologies where someone wrote an article on Medium saying why you should use it instead of something else, whatever was hot at the time. And if you pick the wrong one, you either now are using an unsupported or less popular technology, or you got lucky. Another aspect of the React wars, and something I'll talk about a little more later, is React is not a full comprehensive framework. It's just the V in the model view controller architecture. And so you have to bring your own model layer. And early on, React was a thing, but then you had to pick which model layer that you chose. And in the React world, they use a model layer called the Flux architecture. And so there were like 30 different choices for this early on, and there were several articles like this of, we compared the top 13 Flux implementations. You won't believe who came out on top. Spoiler, the one that came out on top for this person was one that's called Alt. Unfortunately, this is about a year ago on the GitHub issues page. Is this still alive? The answer was not really. And this package, at the time when this article was written, was about, I don't know, a year old maybe. So the Lindy effect, it lasted about a year and then died. So you can either support it yourself or something else. And then the correct answer was one that didn't even exist at the time. It's called Redux. That was the one that kind of won as the most popular choice. But then even then, we're not really sure if we should use it or not. So it's complicated. It's called the bleeding edge for a reason. You might get cut if you use it. Some reasons why you might want to choose a more mature framework like Django, just something that's been around longer. Mature projects have momentum. There's a lot of people using them. That means a lot of people are asking questions on Stack Overflow. There are 160,000 questions. If you have a question about it, somebody has probably already asked it, and you can just find their answer. There are a lot. The ecosystem is very large. There are over 3,000 packages directly for Django in the package libraries that are out there. And that's not even counting all of the enormous Python standard packages that are out there. Whereas there aren't as many things for newer technologies. Mature projects also have processes. And this is something that can reduce the risk in your business. Django, as something that is mature, has things like the Django Foundation, which provides things like funding, and I believe they actually have one person dedicated to just fixing bugs in Django, like as their full-time job, and that's probably contributing to Django's longevity. Django has an established release process. They follow some form of semver, so you can be relatively confident that your updating minor versions isn't going to break your app, things like that. All of these things contribute predictability to your upgrade process. One thing that I think is very important as a person who is paranoid about security is that Django actually has a security process in place. So they're thinking about that at all, first of all, and then they also have a process for dealing with it. As I said, in business, uncertainty is risk. Ideally, we would know exactly what was going to happen. This is a guy, Seth Godin. He's bald like me, so I like him. He talks about the product adoption cycle. You have the people, a few people on the bleeding edge over here, the innovators, the early adopters, late majority, or early majority, late majority, and so on. If I'm starting a business, I want to choose my technology so that they're like about there. Not so early that, I'm on the bleeding edge, not so late that I miss the value that can come from new tools. I feel like Django is kind of in the sweet spot. It's 12 years old. It's not the oldest web technology that exists, but it is old enough to not experience some of this. Sort of a non-web example here is the back in the 80s, Nintendo and Sega were dueling it out in the handheld video game market. And the Game Boy and the Game Gear were the two things. There was a guy at Nintendo, his name was Gunpei Yoko, or however you say that. He had the philosophy of use withered technology, or you could also translate it as seasoned technology. Things that have been proven produce less risk, and the Game Boy did sell an order of magnitude more units than the Game Gear for various reasons, but they credit their success to this idea. The Game Boy used simpler, cheaper, more understood components, so I always like that story. So use a framework that's mature. It might go well for you. Thing number 2 that I like about Django is that it is opinionated. If you read the Zen of Python, one of my favorite parts of it is there should be one and preferably only one obvious way to do it. Why is that good? Well, there's this thing. It's also something from the Rails world. Ruby on Rails and Django are very similar. One uses Ruby and one uses Python. But they have similar ideas. Convention over configuration, or you are not a beautiful and unique snowflake in the technology parts of your business. You are a beautiful and unique snowflake in the product that you're making, theoretically, but being unique and special in the way that you do your tech doesn't do anything for you. Another way to think about this is, I want to make fewer uninteresting decisions in my programming process. And so a reason that I like Django is that it is all-encompassing. It does everything that you need to build a database-backed website that has forms and shows data. Some of these other frameworks, like Flask or React, it only does the view part, are great pieces of software, but they require you to make lots of choices about the parts that you're going to use. It's like, oh, we need to choose a model layer. Oh, we need to choose a form layer. Oh, we need to choose all these things. These choices don't really add any value to your business, but they're things you have to decide. It gives you more flexibility, but do you need that flexibility? This is a tweet that kind of went viral a while back. React was famously hard to get started with because there were so many choices you had to make. It was almost like you had to build your own compiler as the first step to creating a React app, and it's certainly gotten better. As a technology that is 4 years old, React is better than it was as a technology that's 2 years old. So this is a spectrum. I'm not saying that never use a younger technology, but it's this was a thing to think about. And going back here, you had to choose your model layer. I hope you don't choose wrong, but you also just have to choose. And you may not choose the same one that other people choose. And another side effect this is you have to wire all these pieces together, and that creates boilerplate. If you've ever seen a Redux app, there is a lot of boilerplate of just, here, let me wire the routes to the components, to the templates, and all this kind of stuff. All of that is just encompassed into Django, and you don't need to worry about it. So compare this to Django, Python, which has the philosophy of batteries included. This is one of my favorite titles of any article I've read recently. I peeked into my node modules directory, and you won't believe what happens next. I learned just about an hour ago that this is not this is a satire article. I believed it 100%. They found the entire, the entire dictionary or something in it, but anyway. But I did actually look inside my node modules folder for a medium-sized React app, and I found 600 packages of this package installed, this package installed, this package. And perhaps a reason why this happens is because the frameworks and the standard library of JavaScript don't include a lot of these basic utilities. And so that means people have to write them themselves. And so there are going to be a lot of different choices then. And and so a large framework and a strong standard library mean fewer third-party libraries needed. And one reason that's good, if we go back, Django has a security policy. A lot of these third-party libraries don't have a security policy, if they're even regularly updated at all. And so I want, as a business owner, to have as much in the larger framework and standard library as possible, because I know that those libraries are more maintained and more reliable, or more likely to receive updates, more likely to last longer. You may have heard about the left pad fiasco that happened a while back. This is a fascinating case study to me, because there was a little teeny library that like every node package relied on called left pad. It pads a string with zeros on the left side. That's all it does. It's 11 lines of code. Because that doesn't exist in the JavaScript standard library. And so somebody made a little micro library. And then the person got mad for political reasons and pulled the repo from NPM, the node package manager. And the entire internet broke because that package didn't exist anymore. And this guy's like, have we forgotten how to program? Just write left pad yourself. It's 11 lines. And he's like, yeah, okay, but I say, I don't want to write that, but I also don't want to have to go get it either. That's all, That's in the Python standard library. It's called zfill, apparently. Or I think there's like 3 different choices you can do, depending on exactly what you want. But which I guess is the opposite of one way to do it, but Python isn't perfect. Nothing is. One other small reason why you might want to do something like this. One way to do it means that knowledge is transferable across projects. So something that I've heard, I forget where I heard this, but someone said every Django project is the same, but every Node project is different, simply because Node has no opinions about what you're doing. So no opinions about which pieces you use, no opinions about the directory layout of your project. And so, whereas Django does, and so if I work on a Django project, I can pretty quickly get up to speed on a different one. And so as a business, if I need to hire developers at some point, that makes it a lot easier to get people up to speed. So pick something that is opinionated, I would say. And so the final point that I want to make, the reason why you would pick Django, is that Django is cruddy. What do I mean by cruddy? I would say that Django is good at CRUD, whereas React is good at swish and flick. There are 2 different ways of making websites that I see these days, 2 very large, high-level ideas. And that is server-rendered static HTML pages, which is kind of what Django, Rails, Laravel do out of the box. If I go to a website, I pull down an HTML document, it has links in it, I click a link, it does a page refresh, it fetches another HTML document, and then it changes to that page. This is how websites have been made for forever. Recently, so we might call that a multi-page app. Recently, there's been this nifty technique called a single-page app. It's only been possible for a few years because browsers haven't been able to do this for very long. But this is kind of where React.js, Vue.js, Angular kind of shine, of things that are highly dynamic, things that are more web app than website. Let's see. So this is a highly precise graph. Client-side JavaScript density trade-offs. So as the amount of JavaScript in your app increases, your power increases, the things you can do on your web page, but so does the complexity. And the reason for that is that single-page apps need some kind of backend. You may have noticed that I'm comparing Django backend framework to React, a front-end framework, and you may be saying, David, that's not a valid comparison. Well, the problem here is that I would argue that a single-page app, because it needs a back-end framework also, in addition to the front-end framework, you're basically running 2 separate web frameworks at the same time. a framework is running on the browser and a framework is running on the server. And so that, in some ways, is a 2 times complexity multiplier for your project. And my business goal when building apps is to be as simple as possible, but not simpler, for all the reasons we've discussed above. Refer again to I hate code and want as little of it as possible in our product. And I would say that if you're using if you're building something that could be classified as a web app, something that you could mistake for a desktop application, like, say, Gmail. This is a view into my everyday life. A single-page app makes a lot of sense. Because you need all this capability to do what I'm calling swish and flick, things moving around, stuff like that. Because, I didn't explain what a single-page app does. Specifically, compared to a multi-page app, a single-page app, when you go to the first page, it downloads a large pile of JavaScript and then renders HTML in the browser. Whenever you click on a link or something that changes, it fetches JSON data from a REST API and then does whatever change needs to happen on the site. That gives you a lot of flexibility and lets you make things like Gmail. I probably wouldn't want to make Gmail in just straight up Django. But there are a lot of other types of sites that don't need all this complexity. And if you try to shoehorn a single-page app into some of these, it can greatly increase the complexity. And I'm sort of on a crusade here to ask people, do you really need a single-page app? Because you may not. So consider a sprinkling of JavaScript. Contrary to popular belief, jQuery still works. It's not as cool as it used to be. It may not be as necessary as it used to be either because browsers have gotten better, but it does still work. I worked for a client that was a microlending organization, and we made a SaaS app that was mostly internal and only had a few public-facing screens. We used Django, and it was incredibly productive. And this is kind of the embodiment of CRUD. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. Django is highly optimized for building pages that consist of forms where you input data, which is saved in a database, and then that data in the database is rendered out into HTML. It's not the most exciting type of app to make, but Django is highly optimized for doing that. And that is really all Django has been built to do for the last 12 years. And we were able to go really fast there. I know for a fact that if we had tried to build that app as a single-page app, it would have taken a lot longer. But most apps are probably somewhere in the middle. Consider Airbnb. Is this a CRUD app, or should it be a single-page app? Well, if I look at this, I see CRUD on the left side and swish and flick on the right side. So consider a gradual increase in complexity instead of kind of going all in on single-page app at the beginning, because it's easier to get closer to the single-page app as you go than it is to go back to the multi-page app. And so I would ask, how much of your next-gen app is still CRUD? Consider that the home page, the About Us page, the Contact Us page, the blog, the login page, the Create Account page, the Profile page, the Account Reset page, the Account Settings page, the Help Docs, probably more, can all just be made with static server rendered HTML, and you could probably build that page pretty fast. React is good at things like this map. I don't think you could do it without JavaScript, but React is not particularly good at forms, whereas Django is really good at forms. And so as kind of one of my last things, I want to kind of give a case study of a site that I think does a really good job of balancing these trade-offs between CRUD and single-page app styles of building things. A company called SmartFile, which I believe is actually a company in Indianapolis. I use them in a client project. They're kind of like Dropbox, but secure, so you can store credit card numbers in them and social security numbers. And you look at their homepage. This seems very CRUD-like to me. It's just a static page. If you go to the footer, there's a whole bunch of links to static pages. Something else that single-page apps aren't particularly good at is search engine optimization. It's getting better, but it's still more complicated than just spitting out HTML. But the thing that I really like about this site is if you go to the login page, you're taken to a subdomain. And everything that's on this subdomain is now a single-page app because it makes sense to be a single-page app. Their core product is a file browser type thing. And if you look at this, it kind of looks like Gmail. I don't see pages per se. It's like something kind of like that. And so they're using Angular here, and then some static server-rendered HTML generator on the front part of it. But it makes sense to use a single-page app here because they need the power. Something that I also really like about this is a lot of sites don't really need a REST API, but if you're building a REST API that other people will use, that is one reason why I might say you could use a single-page app architecture because you're already building an API. And I noticed that their app actually uses the same API that they make available to other people. So that's kind of cool. The takeaway from all this is that software engineering is about trade-offs. Is Django the correct choice for your software startup? I don't really know because I don't know what your startup does. It might be. I think it probably is a good choice, but that's something that you need to figure out by thinking about the business case here. I probably wouldn't use Django for a real-time video game server. That's not something that Django is particularly good at, and there are other technologies that are younger but have that power available to them. But that comes with the risk of a younger, less mature technology. So software engineering is all about trade-offs. And if you can think about the business case, as we talked about in the first part, that allows you to make these choices and become valuable. So in summary, consider using mature tech, consider using opinionated tech, consider that you might not need a single-page app, and consider that the business value of your code, consider the business value of your code to become stupidly valuable to your employer or whoever else. I'm David Colgan. I run a little company called Less Boring Solutions. I make SaaS apps. If you want me to make your app, I could do that. Or if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd love to talk about anything. If you're also interested in learning more about this whole idea of thinking about the business side of your code, I have a mailing list where I send out an essay about that kind of thing once or twice a week. If you want to sign up, you can go to lessboring.com/letters. And thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, thanks, David. Let's give him a big round of applause. We do have time for a couple questions. If anyone has some questions for David, I would love for you guys to do that right now.
All right.
Any questions?
Yes.
Yes.
What are maybe some signals you look for to determine whether or not you're on the very back end of a mature technology curve?
Please repeat the question for the recording.
What are some signals that you look for to determine whether you're on the back end of the technology curve? So you mean the later adopters part of it?
12 years from now, Django is probably doesn't have 24 years of life left, right? So how do you kind of go about evaluating that landscape?
So the idea of the Lindy effect is that actually as a technology gets older, the likelihood of it lasting longer becomes even longer. So if Django gets to be 24 years old, it'll probably last for another 24 years. But that isn't always true. Like in technology, sometimes, COBOL is probably not going anywhere, but you probably don't want to use it because it's not powerful enough. So there is kind of this trade-off between power and likelihood of not going away anytime soon. So there is kind of, it is something you have to consider. Ways that you could think about that. I mean, I really think that popularity is a fairly good metric for whether a technology has a future. If people are using it, talking about it, if there's a conference about it, something like this, that's a pretty good sign. So, number of questions I mentioned, are there commits on GitHub happening? Are companies still using it? So things like that I would look at.
Excellent. Anyone else? Oh, here we go, right here.
What did you say the letters
So I've been writing an essay every week, every 1 or 2 essays a week about kind of the business side of code. So if you want to learn more about how your code affects the bottom line of companies and kind of move from that freelancer to consultant, or I've heard it described as like a pair of hands typing versus actually problem solving. I write about that kind of thing.
Awesome. Go subscribe.
Cool.
The question over here.
Yes.
Yeah, Cameron.
So, your talk was less about Django and more about why I hate JavaScript, which is a passion.
Fair enough, yes.
Make sure you repeat this question.
So, you didn't give any reason for me to actually choose Django over any of the other Python frameworks or any other backend framework here. You just said don't do React, which couldn't do any of this stuff. It's front end framework. So, like, why would I choose Django over 1,000 other technologies that are even older than Python?
Sure, that's totally fair. Part of that is just I didn't have time, but I do have opinions about that. The question was, there was less talk about why to use Django compared to why not use other things, and that is definitely a fair point. Some things that I would say there, there are a lot of frameworks out there for generating HTML. I do like Django because it does seem a little more cohesive than some of the other frameworks. I like it because Django seems more conservative than some other frameworks. I would pick it over Rails. Like, I started using Django 6 years ago, and the choice was Django or Rails. I picked Django because I felt like Django was a little less risky with its choices. Like, Rails is pretty old, but it seems like it's made it's done a lot of experimenting, so to speak. And I feel like Django has not done as much of that, which is subjective. But I have had a lot less trouble with it than I feel like some other people have of like upgrading it over the years and things like that. So that would definitely be something to add more of to this talk. So.
Actually, can I add on to that one real quick?
Yes.
So there was a pretty popular blog post that went around the internet about 2 years ago where you kind of get 2 new technology tokens. And if you burn those on crazy stuff, you're done. Like, so if you pick, some random JavaScript front-end framework and Mongo, you've basically at that point burned your 2 tokens, and that you need to now use boring technologies. Where if you stick with Django, you've got a lot out of the box, and you don't need to burn those 2 tokens on random technologies.
Django is incredibly boring.
Right.
Fair enough. I do like Django though. So
Oh, hold on. Gene's got a question.
yes.
So I know Django's good stuff, but using Django with a NoSQL database, since it's
Database. Oh, I have opinions about that.
I do too.
Do I have opinions about using Django with a NoSQL database? So a while back, Mongo came out, and it was like, the meme was Mongo loses my data, but I think they fixed that, but I'm not sure.
Mongo is web scale.
Mongo is web scale. That was the trade-off, right? It'll be web scale in exchange for sometimes losing your data. Document database versus relational database. I would argue that most data is relational and a little bit is document style. And from everything that I've seen, there's a library for Node. Mongo seemed to be kind of the correct choice for database for a while. There's this library called Mongoose, which seems to basically enforce a schema on Mongo. And I'm like, oh, you're just recreating Postgres poorly. So Postgres recently added the ability to have a JSON field, and now there is no reason to use Mongo because you get the best of both worlds there. That is my strong opinion held loosely.
That's exactly what I was going to say. JSONB now allows you to index large blobs of data.
So were you saying, Calvin, that basically you get 2 weird choices in the tech for your new company?
Correct.
Okay.
If you want to get one of those tokens back, you have to give up one of those.
Yeah.
unboring technologies.
So my company is called Less Boring. Django is the least interesting web framework I know of. For a long time, I was like, I hate writing in Django. It's so boring. I'd rather use Elixir or Clojure or something. Those frameworks are very cool, and they do really cool things. But all the reasons I said above are why Django is the choice I would go to if I was actually spending someone else's money and that kind of thing. So.
Excellent. Any more questions for David? Oh, yeah, one more back in the back here.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not simple. It's elegant. Yes.
That is a good point. I guess you have to define what boring means. It's not novel, I guess, could be one way of saying that. It doesn't have that excitement. But I guess even as I say that, I'm now old, having turned 30 a few months ago. So I care more about other kinds of interesting. I was talking to a fellow freelancer who also recently turned 30, and he said, "You're officially old when the internet moves from being exciting and magical to something I have to deal with, something I don't understand." So, but that's a good point. It allows you to focus on the more interesting parts of your product. So I think maybe when I say it's boring, I'm thinking of I didn't really have a good thing that I was building with it, and so the tech was the interesting part for a long time for me. So maybe this is a reason to just work on better projects. So, but good point.
All right, let's give David another round of applause. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you.